Yay, thank you. Woohoo. Well, good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I am Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. Thank you all so much for joining us on this beautiful evening. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Steve Grove, the publisher and CEO of the Minnesota Star Tribune and the author of the new memoir, How I Found Myself in the Midwest. But first, on behalf of the library and friends, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. Today, the effects of colonization and oppression are felt locally by our Indigenous communities. And by offering this acknowledgement, we commit to recognizing Indigenous nations and to the ongoing work of reconciliation. Thank you. And now I'd next like to recognize our wonderful sponsors who help make this free series possible. A huge thank you to LSC Architects, Ice House, Knorr Company, and the Minnesota Star Tribune. So let's give them all a hand. Now, before the chilly temps and changing leaves of fall are arriving, we have a few more rays of sunshine to share with you about our incredible library. Now, last month, we asked our friends to share with us library love stories, and wow, did you deliver? Now, Henry responded, not long ago, I spent a long time at East Lake Library, but for now, this isn't possible. The at-home delivery service has become my centerpiece. A highlight of my week is seeing the blue library package in my mailbox. And now a note from Rebecca reads, a couple of years ago, I decided to become reacquainted with the library, and I have enjoyed it so much. I even had an appointment with the grand piano at the downtown library and recorded some great sounds there. And finally, this beautiful summary from Susan. Thank you for the kindness you provide to all. Our questions and searches are addressed with honor. The best card I have is my library card. Now, a special thank you to all of you library friends who took part and for sharing such endearing stories with us throughout the summer. And here with a recap of more summer fun is our Hennepin County Library Director, Scott Dimstra. So please join me in welcoming Scott to Talk at the Stacks.
Oh, thank you so much for the warm greeting. I'm thrilled to be back at Talk of the Stacks for the first series of events this fall season. But before we begin, as you've heard, this summer, the library staff have introduced a fun new initiative at our libraries so that you can get to know our libraries just a little bit better. The Library Passport. The Library Passport program found library patrons of all ages zipping around Hennepin County to visit all of our 41 libraries and get their passport stamped at each one. Just a warning though, you cannot board a flight with these, you can only board the library. And tonight, I'm thrilled to share the adventures of Ruby, one intrepid passport user. Sit back and enjoy.
The Minnesota Library has a great view of Lake Minnetonka. The St. Bonifacius Library used to be a bank. The Long Lake Library started in 1913. Now it's in a strip mall. The Brooklyn Park Library has an awesome kids section.
Favorite part is, no, it's in the strip mall. And so as you saw, Ruby knows how to have fun, how to use her library card, and how to use her passport as well too. And I encourage you to visit any of our 41 libraries, simply ask a staff member for a passport and begin your journey to getting them stamped at each of our locations. Who knows, we might ask you to be our next Ruby and social media star. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's guest. Tonight's moderator, independent journalist Marianne Combs, is the co-founder of the Center for Broadcast Journalism, a nonprofit dedicated to mobilizing the next generation of reporters. In 2020, she was named Journalist of the Year by the Minnesota chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Tonight's special guest, author Steve Grove, is CEO and publisher of the Minnesota Star Tribune. Previously, he served as Minnesota's Commissioner of Employment and Economic Development. Before moving back to his home state, Grove built a career in Silicon Valley as an executive at Google and YouTube, most recently as the founding director of the Google News Lab, and previously as YouTube's first head of news and politics. In his debut memoir, How I Found Myself in the Midwest, Grove shares a passionate testimony to the power of moving forward by going back home. Released this summer, the new memoir has been hailed by the beloved journalist Katie Couric as a must-read book about finding meaning and purpose in your own backyard. Please join me in welcoming moderator Marianne Combs and special guest Steve Grove to Talk of the Stacks.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, and thank you, Steve, for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. Yeah, congratulations on this book.
Thanks.
It was a thoroughly enjoyable read, both highly relatable in terms of your experience leaving Minnesota and finding your way back here, which I know a lot of Minnesotans have experiences with. Also, it was very relatable as somebody who moved to Minnesota later in life, and that sort of finding your community, figuring out where you fit in. It's also a really informative book in terms of how it looks at Minnesota culture and documents the struggles of the state government as it wrestled with COVID and then the murder of George Floyd. Huge issues to take on. It's no small feat to be able to weave that personal story with this very sort of epic national story, but focused on at the statewide level. So congratulations.
Thanks. It was fun to get to do.
Yeah. So what compelled you to write this memoir? Why did you say, my personal story and this big story, they need to be told at this level?
Yeah. Well, and thank you all for coming, by the way. It's really an honor to have you all here and to get to share more about the book. I guess I'd always wanted to write a book in my life. I thought that'd be a fun thing to do, but I had no idea what it would be about. But I've always loved to read, and I like to write. I guess where I landed with maybe this is the topic that might provide that opportunity was this moment of coming back to our home state and the boomerang story of Minnesota, which is a common one. How many here have left and come back to Minnesota? I'm guessing I'm going to see a lot of hands.
Oh, yeah.
My wife jokes, she's from San Diego, she says every Minnesotan has a homing beacon buried inside of them somewhere, and it goes off at some point and you come back. But that, I think, is a pretty universal story. I think somewhat less common, perhaps, is leaving Google and tech and going into government at the time that I did, and then the insights that just came forward in that experience that as I began to share with friends back on the coast who were wondering, what is it like? Like, you left Google, you're now a bureaucrat in government, became, I think, the stuff of maybe a more unique story to share. And so as I began reflecting on what it's like to be a native son and come back home with some fresh eyes and the things you learn about your home state, that idea of the personal reinvention of kind of leaving one place and sector professionally and going to a new place was on my mind. But then the community reinvention of Minnesota at a unique time for our state felt like kind of two parallel storylines that might be interesting to explore. And when I began pitching the idea to publishers, they actually liked the personal side more than the historical side, although both kind of ended up weaving together. And so the book becomes something different as you write it, but really an honor to get to do.
Who did you write it for? And I asked that because the book is, like you said, it's about leaving an international job with Google for a state level government job. It's very much about Minnesota.
Yeah.
But you titled it How I Found Myself in the Midwest. Why not How I Found Myself in Minnesota?
Yeah. Probably to sell more books because the Midwest is a larger region, if I'm totally honest. I think you can.
Fair.
We resonate with being Midwesterners, even if we like the bold North, and certainly at the Strip, we lean into that. I think the Midwest is a really definable idea, and so I think that resonated. I guess when I started writing it, it was a time when I think my wife Mary and I were maybe earlier in a trend line of people leaving the coasts and going to new places. And so it felt like perhaps it's a book that might help those who are considering where they might want to go in a world where mobility is shifting rapidly. I also think at a personal level, everyone in this room has your moments of reinvention. That's not unique to me in any way, but people looking for a fresh start or thinking maybe I might want to try something different with my career, that was on my mind as I was writing. I think a lot of times in life when you're considering a new chapter, whether it's professional or personal, and it's scary to you, as it often is, because trying something new is hard. You forget what a superpower a fresh pair of eyes is. And in fact, leaving something like Google and going into government, or leaving government and going into media, like these are some pretty abrupt shifts for me, but I have found that sometimes being the new or different person in the room had some value to it. And so as I thought about people reading, and it was like, well, big or small, or tech or media, or government or tech, doesn't matter. If you're looking to reinvent and try something new, I hope there's something hopeful in here that it can be done. And so that was on my mind too. And I guess I'd be lying if I didn't say, I hope that the book shines some light on the Midwest for those who don't live here, and particularly Minnesota. Not that it's a boosterism book. I mean, I hope people see hope in this region and the value in Minnesota. It's not a cheerleading book, but I think it does reflect well on the state ultimately. And so that was on my mind too, is like, if you're on the coast and you're reading this, you might think, oh gosh, there's more happening over there than I might have thought. The working title of the book was Fly Over No More, which I kind of liked. The publisher said, we could do without that, so here we are.
So for you specifically, what is it about Minnesota that drew you back from California?
Family. You know, my mom and dad are here in the second row tonight, Doug and Mary Jo Grove. Glad they're here. And I write about this in the book, but they're incredible grandparents, like the grandparents that you want to have for your kids. And so my wife and I had twins after a long struggle with IVF, and that's chronicled in the book as well, but a really important moment for us. And it kind of gave us a perspective of like, well, where do we want to raise them? And it led to a more deliberate set of decisions about where we might want to live. And I had never thought about coming back to Minnesota. I think like many kids growing up here, or maybe many of you in the room, I always wanted to leave. Like the idea was, go west, young man, or go wherever, go somewhere different. And I hadn't thought I'd come back. But you have kids and you wonder where you might want to raise them. And Mary and I, when we were in the Valley, we started a nonprofit called Silicon North Stars, where every year we would bring about 15 young people from the Twin Cities out to Silicon Valley. And my wife's job at Google was she ran a team called Google for Startups, which was essentially all of Google's efforts to do outreach around the world to help build the next Google, help new startups grow and thrive. So she was an expert and is an expert on startup growth. And so she would put these kids through a boot camp of like how to create your own startup. These are like 8th graders. But then we'd have them pitch like a crew of venture capitalists the size of this room, and they would just blow them away with their ideas. Anyway, so through that, we got a connection back to Minnesota because we would meet these kids, we would come back with them and such. And so it felt like, maybe this is a place we want to give a try, but it was the chance to be near family, like so many, and raise our kids here. We didn't know how long-term of a decision it was. It was a bit of a bet. But it was actually Mary's job that made it possible, and I write about this in the book. But when we came back, I was still with Google, but what kind of made it professionally possible is that Mary was at Google but was leaving, and she'd gotten a job with a venture capital firm called Rise of the Rest. It was her, Steve Case, the co-founder of AOL, and JD Vance. And the three of them were starting this firm to help invest in startups outside the coast. This is pre-Vice President JD Vance, so it's a bit of a different era. But they came here, or she came here, because in part, if they're going to invest in startups outside the Midwest, why not be based outside of the coasts, why not be based in the Midwest? And it turned out to be kind of a nice lens into these ecosystems outside of these coastal tech hubs that kind of powered her arrival. So I guess for a lot of reasons, it's a long answer to your question, but it was a lot of things that came together, and then we learned.
And I think also you reference this in the book, that it's also a bit about like the privilege of where you were living in California. That felt almost a bit like a bubble, that it wasn't maybe grounded in the reality of life that you might want for your children.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when I went to the Valley, it was kind of the utopic era of the internet. And, suddenly these new platforms were exploding. I was like employee 85 at YouTube. It was really early. It had just been acquired by Google, but it was like still very startup-y. The idea of a viral video, was just now kind of coming into view. Today, it's just kind of the accepted reality. And most of it seemed really powerful. I mean, the moment that brought me to the Valley and to YouTube was a clip uploaded in rural Virginia by just a bystander who was watching a campaign rally of a senator named George Allen, who used a racial slur in rural Virginia, thinking he was only speaking to these 25 sort of white voters in this small town. But in fact, because of YouTube, now he was speaking to the world. And this viral clip ended up unearthing a whole host of other concerning racist tendencies of that candidate. George Allen lost that race by about 0.1 percentage points to Jim Webb. That not only flipped that Senate seat from right to left, but flipped the entire Senate from right to left. And so there's just sort of YouTube political, watershed moment. And so I came to YouTube to help the team figure out what to do with that. And so that's what brought me to the Valley. And I think it was, in those early days, really powerful. And it still is today. But there was a lot, I think, that involved over the next 8 to 10 years, and even now we all know well the challenges of big tech that made us wonder, like, gosh, maybe the best tech isn't being built in the Valley. Maybe it is kind of a bubble. Maybe we aren't looking outside and understanding what the rest of the world is like before we build these huge at-scale technologies. And so, yeah, I think part of the idea of coming here was, when you look at the tech ecosystem in Minnesota, it's a very purpose-driven ecosystem. We're trying to like cure cancer and solve heart disease and feed the world. And the kinds of companies that get started here are different. And I don't mean to say they're better, but they do tackle problems that feel a bit more rooted in how we're gonna move forward as a country, and maybe less on just gimmicking and grabbing your attention. So that was part of it.
So, and also they're not as interested maybe in the scalability, that they're focused on, it sounded like from what you're saying that, you know, a lot of businesses are like, how can I scale? How can I go big and suddenly make $1 million?
Yeah,
and a lot of
yeah.
these were like, well, how can I solve this problem? And then if the problem needs to be, you know, the problem is something that we need to scale for, we'll do that. But it's not the priority when looking
That's
at it.
right. I think there's a lot of power in going local, and that's a theme that comes up in the book consistently. But I think in tech in particular, if you're focused on solving a very unique problem in your community, you're going to design to solve it in the best way possible, rather than, you know, Google. I'll give you an example. One of my chapters at Google was leading the partnerships team for Google Plus, the most viral, successful social network of all time. I'm sure you used it today when you woke up. You probably used it 10 minutes ago. No, I mean, it doesn't even exist anymore. It was a massive failure. And for Google to try to start something like that at scale was really hard, whereas Facebook started in one dorm room, and then another dorm room, and then another campus, and that kind of organic growth is powerful. I think here in Minnesota, it's a somewhat similar trend, where if you're trying to solve for a particular use case here, and you get it right, then you can scale it more responsibly and thoughtfully versus trying to do something that just instantly works for everyone. It kind of changes the problems you try to solve. And so that's one of the differences that I try to lift up between kind of the Valley and the ecosystem here.
Mm-hmm. Now, you came back here working still for Google, but then you had an opportunity to lead DEED at the state government after working on Governor Walz's campaign.
Yeah.
So here you are, you switched from tech innovation, you know, move fast, break things, to government bureaucracy, the institution. Why?
I got that question a lot back then, and even yet today. I'd always thought maybe public service would be an interesting chapter. And I had met the governor back when I was in grad school and volunteered on his campaign for a summer, and was really kind of impressed by him. And I didn't do anything substantive, really. I did some get out the vote stuff. I wrote a few policy papers, but we stayed in touch. And, you know, he won a pretty big upset victory as a teacher in Mankato over his opponent. And so when I came back and he was running for governor, we reconnected, and I started to help him connect to the tech community, and did a few events with him. And then just kind of wondered, you know, maybe I have a chapter in government in me. I think working for Google was great, but doing it here remotely, it wasn't helping me meet new people. I was just on video conference all day. And I was like, if we're going to go all in on Minnesota, let me get a job that's based here. And I didn't know how long it lasted or what it would be like, but the jobs commissioners, which is essentially what I was, seems like the kind of role where if you're from the private sector and you might not know much about government, you still could add some value, because it matters that you understand the private sector. And so it felt like a natural role if I was going to do it. And so I was lucky that he thought so too, and it kind of worked out. But the job I signed up for is obviously not the job that I ended up having. I signed up to help grow jobs, attract talent, build the startup community, and what have you. And then a year later, COVID happened, and like in a week, we lost 417,000 jobs. So it just became a very different job, and the book goes into that crisis. But, you know, I would say for anybody thinking about going into public service, you might as well do it when there's a crisis. You can be put to your best and highest use, and things, you know, can be really impactful when things are challenging. So,
What did you learn about the two work cultures, and like what's good about each of them, what's bad about each of them, what they can learn from each other in terms of the private and the public?
Well, I'll start with Google, I guess. I mean, Google's a pretty special place. You're walking to the water fountain, you bump into a Nobel laureate. It's like that kind of talent, you know, that you're just surrounded by. And it's invigorating and incredibly exciting. And it's a very innovative culture. You are expected to try things. If you are not innovating, you're kind of seen as like, what are you doing? You need to be trying something new. We want to see what you're trying and failing at. And so I just grew up in that culture. So I developed this a sort of tolerance and excitement for it. Government's different. We all know that. And there's good reasons for that. My first day as a government official, I'm in a room, they're kind of give us all a big binder to kind of go through, and they give you a presentation, here's how to do government. And I was reading every word because I never worked in government. And the very first slide on the slide deck was a picture of a goldfish in a bowl. And they said, this is your new life. Everyone's watching you all the time. And so anything you say or do may end up on the front page of the Star Tribune, so watch out. That's true now that I'm at the Star Tribune. That is actually kind of how it works. But you can imagine the kind of culture that creates. Like, well, I'm not going to take a risk. I'm not going to try something new because if I end up in the front page, if I make a mistake, like I could lose my job. And so almost the exact opposite incentive structure exists. However, what I found inside of government is there's actually a ton of innovation inside of our government agencies. And there was a ton of new ideas kind of bottled up inside of people and in teams that just didn't have a chance to be resurfaced. And my first year there before the pandemic hit, we worked a lot on culture. We built an innovation lab. We tried to create ways we could surface more innovation. And we were humming along. I think we were making some progress. But what really changed it in ways that I think ultimately changed government long term was the crisis of COVID and the murder of George Floyd. Because when crisis hits, actually the incentive is you have to innovate, because if you don't figure out how to get $15 billion of unemployment insurance out the door like we had to do, then you're gonna end up on the front page of the Strip for the wrong reasons, that you couldn't figure out a way to navigate a new situation. And so I guess it's like anything in life, like crisis breeds opportunity for change. But I was really pleasantly surprised by how many people inside of government really did want to innovate. And they, certainly not everybody loved having the Google guy come in to be their new leader, if you will. But I did find a lot of people were like, well, you're here, so we now have a chance to. There's a lane. And so kind of goes back to that point I was making earlier about being in one sector and moving to another. Yeah, you might have to ask why 10 times a day. But asking why 10 times a day might actually make the institution better if you're really honest and you're listening to the answers and you bring a fresh perspective. And I think that helped energize the agency in ways that I hope were useful, and I hope the same is true with the Strip. We're on a journey.
Absolutely. We'll talk more about that Star Tribune journey later. But first, you take a very clear-eyed look at Minnesota exceptionalism and the Minnesota paradox.
Yeah.
What do you see as the state's greatest strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole chapter in the book called Exceptionalism, and we all know it, the Garrison Keillor quote and what have you. Everyone's, every woman is stronger, every man's better looking, every kid's above average. And we all kind of chuckle. And quite honestly, like if you look at all the top 5 lists in the country, we're on a lot of them, right? We've got, highest levels of income, great levels of wealth and impact, great parks, lakes, you name it. Like you can go down the list. And as deed commissioner, I had to memorize all these things. It was part of my pitch, right, to get people to move here. And it is a really special state, and I want to understand why that is. Like, why did we get to a place where you have all these indicators that seem so strong? And so the book goes into kind of the background of that and kind of why we have that sense of exceptionalism. And there's a whole history behind some moves that were made in both the 30s and then later in the 70s that really changed the trajectory of how we distributed wealth here and how we invested in infrastructure and how this became a state where you really can claim that rural Minnesota is stronger than most other rural parts of the country because of how we invested in sewers and highways and what have you. Anyway, I found that interesting. And of course, we all know the Minnesota Miracle, Wendy Anderson, the Walleye, the Time Magazine, all of it. But the paradox is there too, and we know that. And so the book doesn't shy away from those pieces. And the gaps in wealth and whites and people of color and the history behind that and the immigration, what have you. So all that said, I guess to get back to your question of what are the greatest strengths and weaknesses, I do think our greatest strengths as a state is our talent. I think we've invested in education. I think we've invested in universities. I think we've invested in a workforce that is really powerful. And as the deed commissioner, back when I was in those days of pitching businesses why here, it was always the talent that drew people here. I think we've just got a system that is invested in people in ways that are powerful. And then I think our greatest weaknesses are probably the fact that, and this is kind of more of a philosophical point, but I think there's a certain blindness to the paradox in this state. There's a certain lack of recognition of some of those gaps. There's a certain kind of glossing of them over. We like to talk a lot about our challenges, but there's a little bit of like I quote a professor in the book, Samuel Myers of the U of M, who kind of coined the term Minnesota paradox. And he kind of put it really succinctly to me. He said, just to take the issue of racism, for example, in Alabama, if someone's racist, they'll just tell you to your face. Here, there's racism without the racist. It's the system that makes it possible. It's the kind of it's the way that the system is contoured. It's the culture. And I don't mean to say all of Minnesota is racist by any stretch, but we have these gaps for a reason. And I think systemically, we haven't caught up to the demographic diversity that really is our future. And that's holding us back. And so I'd say that's has been our biggest weakness. I think George Floyd's murder woke many people up to that. And the book goes into, how that's transpired up till now. And I think we've made some good progress. But as a white man leading an agency designed to help empower the growth of the Minnesota economy, I was keenly aware that this was a significant weakness, and not just a moral one, but an economic one.
Yeah, and I would argue with this phrase, it was racism without the racists. We still have our racists.
We do, yeah.
They're just not in your face about it, like in
I think
day-to-day
that's right.
conversation.
Yep,
But,
I think that's
but they're
right.
still reading those mortgage applications and saying, "Oh, Anne will get it, Aisha will not."
Yep.
You know, and
It's
so-
there. Studies
yeah.
show it. You know, it's not just anecdote.
Yeah, exactly. So this is also a book about a faith journey. I
Yeah.
mean, you started out, you actually had kind of a traumatic relationship with the church growing up when you're younger, but then you end up saying that faith communities have a key role to play in rebuilding our sense of shared identity and belonging. Tell me more about that, how
Yeah.
you came to that.
Well, at a personal level, I grew up in an evangelical church, and for a long time, like any kid who grows up in a church, you're all part of that journey, and then you get to high school and you're starting to think for yourself and you start to examine it. And I felt that maybe that wasn't the path for me, and I write really candidly about my relationship with my parents and how we navigated that together. And so I spent most of my 20s and 30s not particularly religious or paying attention. I very much cared about the questions that are at the core of religion and spent a lot of time grappling with them, but it felt like I just don't know if there's a place for me in a church community, especially if it's more focused on, I guess, solely the concept of personal redemption and less on community, growth. And every church is different, so I don't mean to make generalizations, but I just didn't have a way back in. I don't know. I felt kind of disconnected from it. And I'm not alone. In the past 20 years in this country, 40 million people have left organized religion. It's a massive trend. It's the biggest drop you've seen in church attendance in the history of our country. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I go into some of them in the book, and there's scholars who have studied why this is. A lot of it's kind of the post-Cold War shift from the kind of dynamic of the Soviets in the US and how clearly religion played a role into our identity at that time. A lot of it has to do with the internet. But when I came back home, I found myself really wanting to have something that was more deeply rooted in the community, and felt that church can do that in a way that other institutions can't. It gets to the very core questions of why we're here and our soul and our future and our community. And I also thought, this is not an uncommon story, but you have kids and you're like, how do you want to raise them? As much as I maybe hit challenges with the church later, I'm really grateful for the religious background I had growing up, because it gave me a real sense of a North Star and of a moral code. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. And I'm like, well, gosh, if I'm grateful for that, how can I create that for my kids? And so this was not something I expected to write about, but it kind of came through as the pages unfolded that, my wife and I found a church in our community, St. John's Episcopal Church on the coast of Lake Harriet, a really great community that, I think very much is in the teachings of Jesus and very much is about community service. And my wife grew up in a family that had both Catholic and Buddhist traditions. There's a Thai temple just 10 minutes from our house, so we go there too. But really what made it possible, quite honestly, is my dad and my mom, who were willing to kind of go on that journey with me and revisit some of the past, but also open up these things we'd kind of ignored for a long time in our relationship about religion and our connection and what we believed. And of course, their faith had evolved, as my views had too. And it was just really one of the tremendous gifts of my life that they were willing to go on that journey with me and give me that opportunity to reconnect with them and learn from them, quite honestly. And I found myself suddenly with a whole new lens on admiring their faith and their journey in their community in ways that I guess when I left the church didn't feel as much. So that was powerful. My brother-in-law in my hometown is the pastor of my parents' church and was a huge influence on me too. And so he played a big role in that. So for me, it was a personal journey of transformation and connection that was quite meaningful and not something that I had on my radar when I came back home, but that felt only natural to include in the book.
And you see that people can find something there that it feels like is missing a lot from communities these days, because we are so online and we are constantly detached in some ways from our
I think that's right.
immediate community.
Yeah, I think religious communities offer something that others don't. And it's not like you have to be in a religious community to have connection with your neighbors, but there's something that transcends some of the political dynamics that we feel divisive about. I think there's a huge epidemic of loneliness in this country that can be fed in faith that is unique to maybe other institutions. The data will show you that half of Americans think they don't have enough friends. 15% of adult men over 40 feel like they have no close friends. That was not true 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm not saying that's all connected to faith, but I do think there's something about those rooted institutions in our community. And I go into the kind of decline of institutions in the book quite extensively because I think that's concerning for so many reasons. But people aren't feeling as connected as they once did. And I don't think the internet replaces that in ways that I wish that it did. Having been a part of these early platforms that grew, I think in some ways they've divided us more. So that's something that I explore, and particularly on religion. It creates these rabbit holes you can go down. We saw this time and again at YouTube where people would be radicalized. online because of the kind of related video algorithms that get you deeper and deeper into a community. I ended up leaving YouTube for about a month during the middle of my time there to go to the White House and help a bunch of other tech leaders figure out how do you stem the recruiting of ISIS, of young Muslim Americans who were headed to Syria and Iraq. You remember this kind of in the mid-2010s, who were going on platforms like ours, frankly, and becoming quite radicalized and believing in truths that just weren't in reality there, and coming back pretty scarred from it. Many Minnesotans were among them. And there's no easy solutions to it, but I think we have to be proactive about it and think more carefully about our technologies if we're gonna use them to create community versus divide us.
There's a theme that runs through this book of what I would call maybe a certain audacious optimism. And maybe it's the way you tell the story versus what really happened, but you say, basically you cold call YouTube and you get a job running their news and political sort of wing.
Yeah,
Of like,
it was early days, right? I mean,
yeah, I know it was,
Yeah.
you're employee number 85, but still, that leads into a career with national and international impact with YouTube and then Google. Then after helping Tim Walz with his campaign for governor, you end up running the Department of Employment and Economic Development, not something you have a lot of experience with, you said,
Yeah.
but hey, you can give it a look with a fresh pair of eyes. Then a headhunter reaches out to you for the publisher position at the Star Tribune. You'd never worked in a newsroom or run a newspaper, but again, hey, sounds interesting and aligns with my passions and commitment to community, so sure. So either you have been afforded an immense amount of privilege and opportunity in your career path, or you are vastly underselling your qualifications in this book. Which is
maybe
it?
both.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, each of those steps, it's, I guess if you're looking at it from the outside, to go from tech to government to a local newspaper, it could be also considered a series of very poor career decisions, given our economy today. But I really enjoyed it, and I guess the theme, I guess, of that shift for me in the book is about going local, and I think the power and immediacy of it, and I've gotten a lot from that. And I would just say, like, yeah, I think there's the fresh eyes to it. Certainly, when you're looking to change an institution, like the two leaders who hired me to do those past two jobs were looking to do, you do benefit from outside pairs of eyes, and so I think that can be helpful. But I guess, at a time when at Google everything seems so global, and you change a pixel and 1 billion people notice, and things are so global and therefore so hard to kind of grab onto, I've really enjoyed a more local focus. It's not parochial, it's not narrow, it feels still very meaningful, but in a different way. And I guess as I think about how we're gonna reinvent these institutions that we need to be reinvented in our society, it's the theme of the book, I don't know what's gonna happen in Washington, quite honestly. It's harder to have happen there. It's too polarized, it's too divided. If we're gonna reinvent the church, or the newspaper, or the government bureaucracy, or the military, or any number of these institutions that are vastly declining in trust, I think, why not start local? There's a lot more opportunity for success. There's less polarization. And why not Minnesota, a place that has this kind of civic fiber that I would argue has faced challenges even yet this year and in the last 5 years in particular, but is still pretty strong. So I don't know, there's a lot of meaning in that.
Awesome. How do you, moving more to Star Tribune now, how do you reconcile your time at Deed, your work to develop jobs and improve the economic outlook of the state, with your very recent announcement that you're shuttering the Strib's in-state printing facility and will be laying off 125 employees at the end of this year?
Yeah, it's been a hard week, and maybe you read this news, but we have a large printing plant in the North Loop of Minneapolis called Heritage. It's literally like our heritage of our company that we're using about 18% of the capacity at this point, just given the decline in print. We lose about 20% of our print subscribers year over year. That's just the trend lines. They're as linear as you're gonna find. And so the economic argument and the business argument is really clear that it does not make sense for us to continue to own a massive printing plant and a very valuable plot of real estate when everything's going digital. Doesn't make it any easier though. I mean, business reasons don't make the kind of human component very easy. And it's been a hard week. I mean, we spent a whole day at Heritage on Monday with all the employees that are gonna be moving on, not till the end of the year. We're gonna be printing there through December. But it's tough. And the move to Iowa, I mean, yeah, I spent my time at D trying to get jobs not to go to Iowa, but to come here. So you can imagine that's hard for all of us too. And not to make it about me, but obviously with the lens on having been in economic development, you're like, gosh, that's not what we want to see happen. But there was no other choice. I mean, to print the paper at the quantity and scale that we needed to, it had to be Des Moines. There wasn't a Minnesota option. So that was hard. I think it's the right decision for the business, and I'm asked to make the hard decisions, and we have a lot of data and thoughtfulness, and really proud of the team for navigating it. And it will be the end of an era. We're still printing, so it's not like we're giving up on print. We know how much it matters to people. It's a medium that really is different than digital. It's fundamentally different. It's not just that it's physical, it's how it's laid out. And there's a certain affection for it. People like the print paper. I met a woman once at a listening session for the Star Tribune who told me, gosh, don't give up on print. Like every day, I go to my front stoop, I pick up the newspaper, I go inside, I put it in the microwave for 30 seconds so I can read a fresh, hot, piping newspaper. I was like, really? I've only heard that once, but it's kind of cool. And so we get that. We get that. Whether you're microwaving it or not, it's a special thing. So it's been a somber week. I'm proud of the team. I'm proud of the team at Heritage for, in many cases, generations after generations have worked there. But we're going to find them, great jobs in the future and work hard on that with my former colleagues at Deed who have all kinds of placement services. And we're going to make sure we recognize the legacy of it too.
It seems to me, based on my career in journalism, that capitalism and quality journalism are pretty much at odds with one another. Investigative reporting is expensive. Reporting that speaks truth to power often makes as many enemies as it does allies. You've championed the notion that people need to relearn to pay for quality journalism and even make donations to private media. How do you propose to do that, to convince people that have become very used to getting their news and information for free online, especially given the economic challenges that Americans face with inflation, student loans, mortgages?
We can't afford not to make that argument, I guess is maybe the first answer, which is that you're not going to be economically viable if you don't have a paying customer base. So I don't think we have a choice of whether to make the argument, but I do think it's a good argument and one that can land better in Minnesota than maybe other places. It is challenging. People's subscription wallets are no longer just the Strib or the Pioneer Press. It's the Strib, Netflix, Disney Plus, Beer of the Month, Trampoline Club for your kids. Like there's just an endless subscription. You probably know how many subscriptions you have, right? And for some people in the room. And so that's a challenge for us. But the other challenge to your point is the sort of apathy and or, news will find me. I can get 90% as good a news elsewhere. I don't think that's true, but people might think that you can do that for free. And so we have to remind our subscribers why it matters. We actually have to invest in investigative reporting, which by the way, does convert at higher levels for getting people to want to subscribe because they get that that's worth paying for versus say the clickbaity article. So I think that's encouraging. But I also don't think that we're going to make it if we just depend on advertising and subscriptions, right? Advertising's been gobbled up by my former employer. We have a great ads team. We do great work, but that's not, going to be the thing that makes up the gap. Digital subs will rise, and we have a goal of getting to 250,000 digital subs by the end of 3 years from now, which is an audacious goal, but we're working hard. We're tracking. We've had 13 weeks of straight digital growth these last few months, which is good.
Again, that audacious optimism there.
We're trying to be optimistic. Yeah, and we have a great team. And we brought a lot of fresh eyes into building on it. But those things aside, we still have to do philanthropy. That's a new thing for us. We have to ask for money from people who can give more. And we have to find other ways to make money. So we've launched this whole new effort on varsity sports called Strib Varsity. It's a micro-focused effort on prep sports. We hope at some point this can be its own standalone subscription. You can imagine business logic here. It's like, well, if your kid's name's in the paper, you want that paper. It's sort of, kind of an obvious thing. In fact, it was based a little bit on an insight we read, I don't know, a couple of years ago when I started of William Howard Taft, a former president of the United States. His brother was a newspaper publisher in Ohio, and he said, the economics of the newspaper are simple. Simply make sure that every year, every single person's name in the town is in the paper one time, and you're set to go. There's kind of some wisdom in that. So Strip Varsity is our version of that. We'll see where that goes. We're doing more cause marketing and other sort of pay-to-play journalism now that's very much separated from the newsroom, but it's new. Some of these things will work, and some of them won't, right? I don't think all of them will glide to success. All that said, we're going to innovate. I don't think media in this country survives, though, without government support. And I'll just be honest about that. Like, I think the direction we're going in this country is exactly the opposite one we should go. Yes, there are challenges and things to watch out for in terms of influence when government money comes to play, but we've figured this out before. Like, they've figured it out in Britain and other countries too. And there are some models in other states that are very market-driven that I think are in exactly the right structure to win. For example, a payroll tax credit if you hire a journalist, or an extra boost for an advertiser who chooses to advertise with a local news organization versus somewhere else. There are also innovation grants that I think very much match market demand. So I'm not saying we have all the solutions, and we're not counting on government funding to save us. But I don't think macro level we get there without some recognition that journalism is a public good, just like plumbing, just like broadband, just like healthcare, all of which oftentimes are run on that model of government helps fund them. And if we don't find a way to change our model, then we're going to see continued decline. We've lost in this country in the last 10 years 75% of the journalists. So that's the crisis we face. And I think if you don't have people out there telling stories, and you don't have a basic recognition of common facts, or even a basic recognition of community storytelling, all the civic indicators start to fall apart. And this isn't just my opinion. This is the data. It shows you that in markets with less local news, you get lower voter participation, lower levels of donation, higher levels of polarization, less youth believing they have a future. These are surveys. So this is a crisis for our country. It's not just like, wouldn't it be nice if you had a nice newspaper? This isn't just about our business model or some kind of philosophical idea. This is kind of what holds us together. So I could go on, but that's why we believe people should pay for news. That's why we make the argument. That's why we're doing philanthropy. But it's also why I think we need communities to rally around us. And I think we're grateful in Minnesota. You have communities rallying around us, but you don't see that everywhere. And I think we still have ways to go here too.
In the last presidential election, several influential newspapers shocked their readers and staff by announcing that their editorial boards would not endorse a candidate. One of those newspapers was the Star Tribune. What role did you play in that decision?
A central role. I own that decision. We all own that decision. I will say that compared to our contemporaries, the Washington Post and the LA Times in particular, I think we got the timing right. They announced it a week before the election, and they did it in ways that I think if you look at Jeff Bezos in particular with what the Washington Post did, felt very much like something's fishy here. This does not seem like it was thought out. We announced it 5 months in advance of the election after a lot of thought and care. We talked to our readers. We talked to dozens of papers across the country. We had internal discussions about it. And I will say this, there's no right answer to this question. There's a really great argument to do endorsements, particularly down the ballot. I was talking to somebody before we gathered here today, particularly for judges and hyper-local candidates where people don't have the time to do that research. I get the value of that, that's real. But a couple of things were at play, and I won't go too long on this, but just to give you a sense for the decision. Again, not an easy one, not a slam dunk. But number one, if we're going to become the Minnesota Star Tribune, then where do you draw the line? Are we going to endorse for Mankato mayor, for New Hope City Council? Where do you start to craft, your lane of approach? Number two, we actually found that those pieces, not only were they not read at any higher rate, but they didn't convert subscribers at a higher rate. And as a business, we have to be thinking about what's going to help us, because it's a huge time investment. And there's a public service to it, yes, but I think that's a piece of it that you have to take into calculation. Number three, there's the political readership that we have and how you become a paper for the whole state. And I would say some would argue that it is the moral duty of a newspaper and editorial board to endorse for a candidate, regardless of the dynamics at play. I would say there are lots of things with our news coverage that helps you make a good decision, especially with these large national races or the governor's race or what have you, where you can get information that hopefully lets you make a smarter decision. But if we're going to attract people from all political stripes, if we so firmly plant ourselves in editorial pages as being for one candidate or the other, it gets harder. And people today do not discern between opinion and news like they might have once did. Maybe this room does. I would assume this room does. We're at a library. You're all very well read. But we hear time and again in studies show this too. People just don't know whether they're reading a news article or an opinion piece. So anyway, these are some factors. I won't go more deeply into it than that, although we certainly could. But it wasn't an easy decision. And it's one that we've said we will revisit. But I think it was the right call for us at the moment. And I think it has built, I hope, new lanes for us to grow our opinion work. But I get that it's controversial, and we get a lot of pushback on it. So it's a fair criticism and a fair question.
And maybe this will generate a similar answer, but just one last question. Is Star Tribune editorial board, although the board still exists, its members now generally write bylined columns instead of editorials. With so many vital issues at stake right now, climate change, trade policy, DEI, immigration, isn't there a need for a stronger editorial voice? Or is that just, you don't see that as part of what the newspaper should be doing now?
I don't know if it's needed in a modern digital media environment, quite honestly. And that's what we're trying to become. I mean, our goal is to go from being a paper of record to a platform of relevance, to go from being a newspaper to a modern digital media company. And when you look at how people consume media today, I think there's a certain honesty in wanting to know who wrote a piece and why they wrote a piece and what their background went into before they wrote it. And that kind of bylined ownership of an argument or an idea is really powerful. Now, we still have an editorial board. It still writes editorials when the times demand it. This is very similar to the approach that other major national publications would take. The New York Times used to write 3 unsigned editorial board pieces a day. They now write 1 a week. They've seen their traffic spike by 1,000% based on that decision. And it's not just about traffic and clicks, but it's about relevance and people who are paying attention and reading your pieces. Most local papers have given up entirely, in my opinion. They've just said, the heck with it. Like, that's social media now, that's blogs, like, that's dicey for us. Why should we even play there? I don't believe that. Actually, we're one of the few papers that has taken the approach of saying, no, we're actually gonna hire more columnists, more community voices. But that's an important water cooler function for the state. But the idea that it has to be the voice of God, if you will, every day, or that's the only way you can get your information, I just don't think that matches today's trust environment as broadly as maybe it once did. And so, yeah, it's not an either or. But I think when you look at what resonates, when you look at kind of the modern contract you might have with someone you're paying to be subscribed to and learn from, I do think byline-owned pieces are more the coin of the realm today. And so we lean into those more. And it gives us a license to do things more creatively too than I think the board, which if you're the board, you have to write a certain way that does not appeal to maybe a broader audience, which we need to appeal to.
Gotcha. Before we shift to audience questions, which we are going to do, so get your thinking hats on for what questions you might have. I've got just two final questions for you. One, working at Deed, you had the opportunity to watch Governor Tim Walz work through crisis after crisis. What do you think of his announcement that he will most likely seek a third term?
I think he's a strong leader, and I enjoyed working for him. I think I learned a lot. And I think during the period of the pandemic in particular, when I certainly never been on TV every day at 2 p.m. talking to the whole state about what we were doing, I learned a lot by watching what both he and Jen Malcolm did. I think being in those moments kind of the teacher in chief and explaining the why behind the decisions and being very vocal and transparent and open about them and saying what you know and you don't know, I just tried to do what he was doing, quite honestly. And I learned from that. And I think for me to get to work with a leader like that was a real treat. And I learned a lot from it. So I think he's been a good governor. I think it was a pleasure to get to work for him. And we'll see what happens. I think the political dynamic is different now. And it sounds like he's going to run.
You have a career that has put you in government, in social media, technology, and journalism and publishing. That is quite a nexus point that you have developed there. Three very important issues. In the past, when asked if this memoir is the precursor to launching a political campaign, you have not outright denied it. So let's daydream a little bit. If you were to run for political office, what office might that be?
Well, let's daydream. I don't know if I want to daydream. Look, my honest answer is my honest answer. I don't like to be super coy about this. I would say, look, I really enjoyed public service. And if you read the book, you'll see that. It was a real honor to get to do. And I could see doing it again someday. I don't have a particular plan on that, quite honestly. I don't have like some thought about what that might actually eventually be. I really enjoy the Strib right now. And I really enjoy the public service it provides. I'm not going to say it's public service in the same way. Having done it, it is different. But it does feel meaningful and it does feel like service. And so I'm really enjoying this chapter, and I honestly don't know what's next, but I think I don't have a lot of time to think about that because we're trying to turn the Strib into something that can last long term, and so I'm enjoying it.
Excellent. Steve Grove, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And with that, we're bringing up the house lights, and Rob Gowdy is joining us. You know him as the Friends of the Hennepin County Library Events Director, and he's going to help field your questions so we can get you on the microphone so that Steve can hear you. All right. We're going to pass the microphone down the row.
Steve, you're very talkative for a Minnesotan.
It's called Talk of the Stacks, right? I'm supposed to.
But I wanted to ask you a question about something you said about Minnesotans. I'm from Minnesota. I have a spouse who did not grow up here as well. And one of the first things he said is, why do Minnesotans never talk in a meeting? And we're all so quiet. And I was curious about everything you said about community. So you're very outgoing, but do you have any perspective, or does your wife have any perspective on why Minnesotans are so reserved in public and don't give their opinion?
It's an interesting point. I mean, we do talk about some of those differences sometimes. And my wife, who couldn't be here tonight, she's at home with our kiddos, but she's a major character in the book. Obviously, character, but my wife, but in the book, a character. And I mean, she's my inspiration. And the book is dedicated to her. She's an amazing, amazing human being, and I've learned a lot from her. And for her, moving here was different, right? Because she did not grow up here. And so I've learned a lot about my home state through her eyes as well. There's a less direct nature in Minnesota that I think is real. We see it a lot. I don't know if it's our kind of conservative upbringing or if it's the fact that you live in the cold north and you have to be a little more careful and what have you. I think a little bit of it is sort of a humility that's there where, we don't like to talk as much about ourselves, even though I think we probably should. As the deed commissioner, it drove me crazy because I want more people to talk about Minnesota. You got to be aggressive and pitch ourselves. And we didn't get into all the economic issues of our state, but like if we're going to grow, we got to be far more aggressive than we are now. But that's a whole nother conversation. So I don't know. I think it's a little bit of a Midwestern thing. It's not universal, but we do sense that cultural difference. I talk a lot about kind of the swagger of the Valley in the book, and then kind of the more purpose-driven, grounded sensibility here. And these are broad generalizations that don't apply to everybody, but I think we could use a little of the Valley swagger. I think they could use a little bit of our purpose-driven nature. Maybe somewhere in the middle is about the right mix. But places are different for a reason, and we have to embrace who we are too.
We are remaining down in front here.
Our book group just read On Tyranny by Tim Snyder, and he has these 20 lessons to try to preserve one's democracy. And one of them is to support a free press. And in that regard, he tries to distinguish between a journalist-supported press and the other sources of news and information that we have. And in that, he focuses on journalistic ethics as the real difference, and the lack of public understanding of journalistic ethics. So my question is for you now as a newspaper person, what have you learned about the role of journalistic ethics?
Great question. I'm kind of jealous of that question. Well done.
Take a seat.
Come on up.
Well, to be clear, and I think most people probably know this, but I'm not the editor of the Minnesota Star Tribune. I'm the publisher. So while our amazing editor, Kathleen Hennessy, who joined us from the New York Times, which is a big deal to leave the stablest ship in journalism and jump here to help us figure out our future, she covers the day-to-day. Of course, I can reflect on the topic broadly because we really care about it. It's our brand. It's what if we don't have trust, we're sunk, right? So we have to have good journalistic ethics. Look, I would say journalists are trained whether in the field or in school or both, usually both, to be ethical in ways that we hold central to our work. And when we have third parties evaluate, is our coverage objective or not, we always land right in the middle. Now, we can make arguments about that and even did an article, and there's definitely a subjective art to journalism. I'm not here to say it's like, a scientific inquiry. It is an art, not a science. But I've also learned this, that you can't just say you're ethical and everyone got their journalism degree and you're off to the races. You have to reinvest in it, and you have to bring in consistently professional development opportunities for your newsroom to rethink these ethics, or at least reroute themselves in them. And it's like any profession. If you don't continually bring experts in and learn kind of the modern media dynamics and rededicate yourself to that, you're not giving the appropriate maintenance to the craft. And so our newsroom has done that. They do that really well. We have a great general counsel who just started last month and replaced our longtime general counsel before, whose job is this every single day. I mean, if you knew the amount of resources we put into a piece to make sure that it is real, it is far deeper and far different than what you see in 99.9% of the slop on the internet. We put a lot of time and attention to it. And sometimes it means you're slower. Sometimes it means you're more thoughtful, but if we say something, it's got to be true. And this is a cultural dynamic that I face at the news organization, which is you've got to have the attitude of high bar of quality for the facts. But then as a digital media company, you have to have a high tolerance for change and launching and iterating and trying new things and not having everything have to be a precious pearl before you put it out there in terms of the idea or the franchise. And those things are sometimes at odds with each other. And so that's a cultural tension we just have to live with and name and talk about. But if we waited to have everything perfect, like Strip Varsity is an example, we launched this prep sports effort. If everything had to be perfect before we launched it, then we would have gotten it out like next football season. And we don't got that kind of time. We just don't. And so our internal motto is swift, clear, and brave. Like we're trying to move as quickly as we can, given the moment demands it. We're trying to be super clear to each other about where we're at. And we try to be brave and do hard things. And so I guess bringing it back to ethics, that's, bravery is what we do every day on that front to make sure we get it right. Because we know one missed fact can really change people's perception.
Once again, we are still in the front of the house here.
Hi, Steve. I have a slightly similar career path to you. I was also undergrad in Claremont, worked at Google for several years, and then did grad school on the East Coast. And now I'm based in New York City, and I'm also originally from Minnesota. So I'm kind of
How do we not know each other?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly 10 years ahead of me.
Okay, that's why.
Yeah. But yeah, my question is, earlier you talked about the reasons you and Mary chose to come back, but I'm curious a little bit about the decision process and how you kind of thought through like the pro and cons of moving back from a coastal city, and any general advice for someone like me who's actively thinking about it.
Oh, welcome home. All right, my shot to convince you. Well, I have a book you might want to read to help with that process. You did? Oh, okay.
Excellent.
We were quite analytical about it. I mean, we got one of those giant 3M sticky board things and did the pro and con list on the, in our living room, and looked through all the reasons why we might want to come and not. And it was not a slam dunk, but it was really came back to family. And again, my folks and our community here, that was the biggest draw. And, I remember when we had our kids, they came out to visit us. So look, there's the analytics, then there's just the heart, right? And my parents came out to see us in the valley and take care of our kids really early. We had twins. Anybody twin parent in the house or no twin? I mean, it's a different parenting journey, and they're an amazing one, but it's intense. And they came out and just were amazing and like took care of our kids in these early days alongside us. And then we went back to work, helped in those early days of transitioning. And then they got on the plane and went home, and we're like, oh. Like, wouldn't it be nice to be near them all the time? And not just for the childcare, but the relationship and the connection. And so that was by far the biggest thing, where I was like, we want to be near mom and dad. And Mary considers my folks like her folks, so it's just a really special relationship. The day we decided, just as a kind of fun anecdote, happened to be the day of the Minneapolis Miracle, where Stefan Diggs caught that pass against the Saints and they won. And we're like, we're doing it, There's some emotional things that kind of land too, but it kind of came fast as well. I don't think my folks knew it was brewing, and then we kind of called them and said we're doing it, and like, wow. And so I'd encourage you to give it some thought. It's not like it's the right path for everybody, but you can come home and also build a new life. And I guess for me, it was, my high school friends all had kids who were like a good 10, 12 years older than mine. I had kids a little bit later in life, so I didn't just slide back into all these old relationships. And I have a whole chapter on how to find adult male friendships in your 40s, which, I'm a generally outgoing guy, but I struggled with it. It was like, how do you ask can we go out for a coffee or something? That kind of thing. It's like awkward. So, I think there's some power and proactivity there, but it's a journey. And if you do it, look me up. We should hang out. We'll grab a coffee.
So a three-part question regarding the Strip. First of all, you're essentially a job printer. You print the number of newspapers at that plant. Question being, okay, what happens to those guys? Where do they go? Secondly, then you're going to have an empty building. Who in the world's going to want it? For what? And the third part of the question is, in your announcement that the printing is going to go to Des Moines, you're saying essentially you're going to back the deadlines, make the deadlines earlier, 7 to 8 hours earlier.
Yeah, I know.
Was there a discussion of the impact of that on those people getting the print paper, which is a fine thing, and I'm an oldster, and I certainly love the piece of paper in the hand, but the impact of immediacy.
Oh, keep that microphone close to your mouth. I want to make sure everybody hears you.
I'm sorry.
No,
So
it's okay.
the impact, with a change in deadline, the impact of the immediacy is gone. The feeling of the customer getting the paper on the doorstep, was that analyzed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, you're making some great points. It analyzed at length. And quite honestly, specifically on sports scores. And it's there's a sort of habitual sports newspaper reader who wants the box score and wants the timely piece. And also for relevancy, because breaking news, missing the pages is, if it
Happens in 8 hours.
Yeah,
right, yeah,
a
it's not
lot
like everyone
happens in
stops
8
at
hours,
5.
yeah.
We did reader surveys, we did analysis, we try to estimate the impact. I won't get into all the business decisions, but of course we know this will be challenging for some who really subscribe for that reason. But we have been in this journey for some time of trying to reestablish what print is versus what it's not. And print can't be the complete paper of record or include everything. We're trying to lean in what print is best at. It is a curated product. The editorial placement gives you the signal of what matters most. It leans heavily on visuals. But we've been pretty honest, and if you open up the front page of the Strip, we have a little paragraph that we wrote just 6 months ago that says, like, here's what print is. It's this, and it's not the website, and here's where you can go to the website for breaking news. But is it ideal? No. I mean, of course, we wish we could have our cake and eat it too, but to make the business work, we've had to make this shift. Now, we're going to do some things on sports scores and breaking news that we hope will ease the transition. So if you're an e-edition reader, for example, which is kind of the PDF, if you will, version of the paper that's online. It is still online. However, it has the same exact physical feel. We're going to find ways to insert the sports into that. So if you like that version, you're not going to miss the box scores and what have you. We're still figuring that out, but we debated this long and hard. But if you're going to survive in this market today, you can't be afraid of change, even if it's not perfect. You have to make some tough calls. And to your question on the real estate, I mean, I won't jinx anything. We don't know where this will go. I just know that the North Loop is an attractive neighborhood. It's really turned a corner in so many ways, and that massive plot of land and that building are in a pretty desirable spot. So we're hopeful, not only that it will add to the value of the community and create more development and jobs in Minneapolis, but also honor the legacy of heritage. I think that's important for us. Anybody who takes over that plot of land, we want to find a way that doesn't forget what it's been to the state as it relates to the Strip.
Where do the other papers go that you print?
Yeah, the Pioneer Press will also be going to Iowa, to Gannett. The Times and the Journal, same. So it's we're kind of all doing this together.
And our next question's in the center of the auditorium.
Hi, Steve. Speaking of change, given your background at Silicon Valley with Google and YouTube, I was wondering if you could comment on the role of AI at the Star Tribune.
Yeah. Well, we wear two hats here, right? On the one hand, we have to wear the hat that is, we're in DC with legislators, making sure we're advocating for smart policy that ensures licensing dollars ultimately go to the providers of the most precious content on the internet, right? Because if we're not getting paid and you get your answer right in that Google search results landing page versus clicking on a blue link, like you can imagine what that does to our business, right? So there's a defensive hat, or posture, I guess. Then there's the offensive posture, which is we cannot afford to miss this technological wave like the news did for the internet or for social media, more for the internet than for social media. And so we're experimenting. We've got an AI lab within the Star Tribune. It is funded by grants from Google and OpenAI that give us some engineering prowess to figure out how we go forward. One of the only local news organizations in the country that has gotten money like that. And not that we're beholden to them by any stretch, but they also, for any number of reasons, want news to figure this out. And so it's both in the front end of creating things like we did a state fair food bot, Strib food bot, that was just fun. That's not our future, but it's kind of a fun thing to experiment with. But more importantly, to the back end of like, how do we more effectively surface 158 years of archives to the right reader at the right time using large language models to discover and retarget that content, which is really powerful content, but just sitting below kind of this iceberg, if you will, of historical data and information. It also allows us to do some things that we don't need humans to do, and that's true in every business, so there's that advantage. But I will come back to the fact that we don't want you to think of the Strib, nor will you ever be thinking of the Strib as like an AI-driven platform. Our differentiator is we have human beings with notebooks and pencils out in the community asking tough questions and writing stories. Like that's the differentiator. So we're doing the right, I hope, levels of experimentation here, but never at the cost of you thinking you're reading something not written by a human who did the homework. That's our whole value prop. If we're going to generate just AI-driven dither, then why would you pay for us? So it's a longer answer than maybe you asked for, but we're trying to do a lot of things at once there, but you can't ignore it. And if you do, you're cooked, I think. So it's an urgent moment.
Thank you so much, Steve and Marianne, for this engrossing conversation. We have time for one more question. But before we do, I want to remind everyone in the crowd that the fun doesn't end here. There is a book signing after the talk. Just outside the auditorium at the end of the bridge is where Steve will be located. And our wonderful partners from the Star Tribune are outside selling copies of the book if you need to purchase a copy of the book to get it signed for yourself or for a gift. I hate to say it, but it's September 10th and the holidays are coming.
Thanks.
So if you know someone who needs this book, you might want to purchase a copy for them. If you're listening online, you can click a link in your follow-up email tomorrow to purchase as well. And with that being said, it is time for our final question.
Thanks for your comments today, Steve. I'm also a former journalist. I left in 2010 from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in the 4th round of buyouts and layoffs. And listening to some of your comments about journalism made me feel very hopeful, but also kind of despairing, because back then we were still trying to figure out the right formula with digital and print, and all of those things are pretty tough nut to crack. And I also returned to the Midwest a year ago after living in Canada for quite a while. And one of the questions the question I want to ask is about journalism and about the loss of 75% of journalists. Because living in Canada, when I moved back here in September, the kind of news that I was watching didn't prepare me for the political turn that happened when I moved back, just because of the kind of reporting I was seeing there. I didn't actually expect some of the things to happen that have happened. And I'm wondering what you think the role of good journalism and journalists could be, if the decline in journalists and journalistic organizations have contributed to our current political atmosphere and situation. And what can those of us in that diaspora do to help solve that problem?
In 60 seconds or less, you know.
Yeah.
Amazing question.
I feel like you should write a book about journalism. That was an amazing question.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that part of the reason that we are polarized as a country is that we've lost 75% of the journalists in the last 10 years, or whatever number you want to choose. Like, I just think the lack of fact-based objective reporting that was never something that we as a society sort of intended to have happened, but happened because of the barreling speed with which technology changed our whole environment, has led to people not having as much access to one distinct source of truth. And even if the economics had still worked out, the internet itself fragments, your sources in ways that can allow people to kind of search for the thing that is more affirming or what have you. But I don't just blame the internet or Google or what have you, and I think they deserve some blame, to be clear. But I do think news organizations didn't lean into this moment in a way that they really needed to. To consider the internet as a marketing device for so long was maybe not the best strategy. I'll give credit to my predecessor, Mike Klingensmith, who used to run the Minnesota Star Tribune. He was one of the first local publishers in the country way back in 2011 to put a paywall up online for the Strib. We owe him that because it helped us get a jump start. Even did it before the New York Times did, for example. Like pretty clairvoyant move, but challenging nonetheless. I would say news organizations, because they didn't get ahead of some of these trend lines, and I don't mean to disparage too much because it's hard to get ahead of trend lines, but because of that, they are not as equipped sometimes for this new era of journalism. And so we're going not just through a structural change, but a cultural one in terms of how we address some of these challenges. But I also think in that process, we kind of lost this brand identity of being the voice of the people. I feel like news organizations kind of gave that up to social media, not knowingly, but it just kind of felt like that relationship with your audience, or that sense of being kind of almost populist, like we're for the people on the street, kind of started to fall apart. And not because anybody in media wanted to be in the ivory tower or felt like, having a more elitist view might make sense, but just because of the dynamics that move so quickly. And so we talk about this all the time in this trip. We have to reclaim that space. We have to reclaim and say, no, actually, we are here for the people of Minnesota. We are here to lift up stories you wouldn't otherwise hear. We are here to hold truth to power. And we're doing that on behalf of our neighbors and friends. And therefore, we need to know our neighbors and friends. We need to be out in community. We need to engage with them, not just when crisis strikes, but every single day. And I think that cultural change is happening inside the building. Certainly, journalists get into the profession for that reason. When we did our statewide tour, my colleagues Tim and Matt helped organize this for the team. And, we went all across the state and we stopped, I'll never forget it, at the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. We sat down with a whole host of tribal leaders, and they were so kind to have us. They fed us lunch. They didn't need to do that, 8 or 10 of us there. But about 5 minutes into the conversation, they said, you all wrote a story 20 years ago about a murder on the reservation. Mm-hmm. And we hated the story. No one here trusts the Star Tribune, and we haven't read you since. And I was like, wow. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's helpful to know. And it was very honest, and it wasn't aggressive. It was just the truth. And of course, later I went back and read the story. I'd never heard of the story. I went back and read it. It was like a 10,000-word investigative story about a murder on the Leech Lake Reservation that I would only assume was written with all the impeccable standards of journalism and truth. But that's the only story the Star Tribune had written about the Leech Lake Reservation for that entire period of time that was of any note. And so if you're them, you're like, well, wait a second. So you come in, you tell that one story, and then there's 1,000 things happening the next day and the next day, but you're not here for that. And so, who are we as the Strib to swoop in and selectively tell that one story we want to tell and then leave? Now, this is not a new problem in journalism, but I think for a news organization that wants to be there for the people, that wants to be able to claim we're the Minnesota Star Tribune now, we got to do better than that. We got to have reporters living in that community that are telling the story the next day and the next. So I guess it's a combination of both news organizations changing how we do things, which is hard with limited resources, but also the community rallying around it. And for those who've left the profession, to your point, which I think is a really good and important questions, I don't want to leave everyone on a down note. It's also an incredibly exciting time to be a journalist. Like the tools at the disposal of our journalists in the newsroom, whether it's data analysts, whether it's data analysis, whether it's computing power, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's any number of ways of reaching new audiences that never existed before. It's also an incredibly exciting time. And that's the stuff that gets me up every day is like, we've got a shot in Minnesota to reinvent local news in a way that could end up becoming the model for the whole country. Now, will we do it right? I hope we do. Certainly the Times and the Journal have done that in the national context. No one's quite done it locally. I think we have a chance here in large part due to the community and to our owner, Glenn Taylor, who's reinvesting. But I think for any journalist who's looking for a way to do that today, I hope they join us, at the Strip and help us figure it out. We need new perspectives and, I give us a pretty good shot. Why not
So
us?
you're hiring?
Why not Minnesota? We are.
Oh, okay.
It's a shift, but we are one of the few organizations that are still looking for fresh new talent, and we're excited about the new voices we're getting. So anyway, thanks for your question. I don't think I answered it perfectly, but those are some of the things we're figuring out. So.
All right. Steve, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you, and we'll see you in the lobby.
Thanks, everybody.